Welcome to the Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies at Johns Hopkins University SAIS. I'm Kent Calder, the director of the center, and look forward to introducing our distinguished speaker for this evening, who will be speaking to the topic of overcoming COVID-19, challenges and opportunities for Japan. Our speaker this evening is Minister Yasutoshi Nishimura, currently the minister in charge of coronavirus disease control in Japan. He is also the minister in charge of Economic Revitalization, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and Social Security reform in Japan, so is deeply concerned with post-pandemic issues as well as Japan's response to the coronavirus pandemic itself. Before his current service, Minister Nishimura served as Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary to Prime Minister Abe and as Parliamentary Vice Minister previously for Foreign Affairs. He's a graduate of the University of Tokyo, but is deeply familiar with Washington and New York as well. As you know, this is an important time in healthcare, of course, with the pandemic raging. It's also an important time in U.S.-Japan relations, with Prime Minister Suga arriving in about 48 hours here in the United States. So it's a very timely occasion to be speaking, and Minister Nishimura, welcome virtually back to the United States, and we look forward to your remarks. Minister Nishimura.
Good evening and good morning, everyone. Thank you for this great opportunity to speak with you here today. I am the minister in charge of both economic and physical policy and novel coronavirus disease control. I believe there are not many ministers in the world taking on these two roles simultaneously. Today, I'd like to talk about Japan's responses to COVID-19 and its economic and social development strategy in the post-corona era. First, I'll explain the measures we are taking against COVID-19. The number of excess mortality due to COVID-19 in Japan is extremely low, minus 15,000, while it is 420,000 in the United States. I believe that the fundamental reason for this is the high awareness and practice of hygiene among the Japanese people. According to a survey, more than 95% of the Japanese people wear face masks, and almost all of Japanese people are familiar with the so-called 3 C's: closed spaces, crowded places, close contact settings, avoidance of which is called by experts. In Japan, we have carried out thorough infection prevention measures which have been put in place, including frequent hand disinfection. Moreover, we have implemented countermeasures based on data and scientific knowledge. Based on data analysis and experiences during the spread of infection last spring, and with the aid of the simultaneous droplet infection using the world's fastest supercomputer Fugaku, we have been improving our countermeasures and making them more targeted rather than mandating the entire shutdown of economic activities, stay-at-home requirements, or restraints on internal movement. We are requesting that restaurants shorten their operating hours, closing by 8 p.m. rather than closing altogether. Amusement parks, movie theaters, and other events have been capped at 5,000 participants and 50% capacity. Even under the state of emergency, both professional baseball and soccer leagues continue to hold games, allowing up to 5,000 spectators spectators. The number of new positive cases in Tokyo has been reduced by around 90% from a maximum of 2,520 on January 7 to 2,520 on January 7 to 256 on March 21st, and the second state of emergency has been lifted. However, reducing the number of new infections to zero is difficult, and small waves of infection will occur. It is important to continue these preventative measures in order to avoid large-scale contagion. Currently, the next wave seems to be approaching. We are stepping up our responses. Some criticize the fact that the number of COVID-19 testing in Japan is much smaller than that of the US or other countries, so there actually be a higher number of cases of infected people that are not being reported. However, Japan conducts efficient tests in places with a high risk of infection, and the number of the tests per mortality is around 1,000, compared to around 680 in the United States. Needless to say, the outbreak of COVID-19 has had a significant negative impact on the global economy. According to the IMF World Economic Outlook released this month, the global growth rate for 2020 dropped significantly to -3.3%. In order to prevent contagion and get the economy back on the growth track as quickly as possible, it is time to do everything we can to recover the economy by firmly supporting businesses, employment, and the lives of people without hesitating to increase fiscal spending. From last spring to the end of the last year, we have been implementing one of the world's largest economic stimulus package, which amounts to $2.74 trillion, over 50% of GDP in total project scale. Thanks to these measures, the government of Japan's economic outlook projects a real growth rate of 4.0% for fiscal 2021, and forecast that the Japanese economy will recover to its pre-pandemic level by the end of fiscal 2021. According to the IMF, among G7 countries, only the US, Canada, and Japan will return to pre-pandemic level by the end of 2021. Japan's employment rate was 2.9% in February, which is very low compared to 6.0% in the United States. We've been focusing on sustaining employment and have succeeded to a certain extent. Our next important challenge is to enhance the smooth movement of labor to promising growth areas. For this reason, we are promoting recurrent education and job training. During the COVID-19 crisis, new positive movements and challenges are emerging. We've seen some from our younger generations achieve great success and achievements, both domestically and worldwide. In the field of sports, for the first time among Asian-born players, Matsuyama Hideki, 29 years old, a professional golf player, won the Masters tournament. And Ohtani Shohei, 26 years old, a major leaguer with the Los Angeles Angels, played both as a starting pitcher as well as second batter. The first time this has happened in 118 years. Ohtani threw 101 mile an hour pitch and hit the first pitch home run. There are also remarkable achievements that were attained by Ike Rikako, 20 years old, a female swimmer who earned the gold medal at the 2018 Asian Games, participant in the Rio Olympics, and holds many Japanese records. She overcame leukemia after 10 months of hospitalization and treatment to be selected for the Tokyo Olympics. During the COVID-19 crisis, nearly 60% of workers in central Tokyo experienced telework, working remotely from home. The number of younger people interested in moving to the local area has been increasing. Currently, the situation in Tokyo, which had been experiencing a continuous influx of people moving into the area, reversed, and we now see people moving out of the area for the first time since these statistics began and recorded. We may now be able to break away from the Japanese infamous crowded train society. In terms of companies, 102 companies were newly listed on the stock exchange in 2020, the highest level since 2007, despite the threat of spread of infection. The entry of companies from other industries, such as Idemitsu, a major oil company, Sony, and SoftBank, has been observed with the development of electric vehicles towards the goal of decarbonization. In the midst of these developments, I expect that entrepreneurial spirit that gave birth to Honda and Sony Toyota will spread to our younger generation. The government of Japan will provide financial support amounting to $110 billion. On the other hand, the current COVID-19 crisis has severely affected vulnerable people groups, such as female non-regular workers, putting them in a difficult situation. We are taking measures to prevent inequality from widening, becoming permanent, and being inherited. We are aiming for inclusive growth so that motivated and capable people, including those who have been severely impacted, can utilize their abilities and seize opportunities. In order to realize new growth in the post-corona era, the government should provide stimulus spending to further draw out the movements and the ingenuity of the private sector. Therefore, I have proposed the 3 New Deals: the Digital New Deal, the Green New Deal, and the Human New Deal. The first is the Digital New Deal. A bill is currently being discussed in the Diet to launch the digital agency in September as a control tower with strong functions and sufficient budget to lead the digitalization of the entire country. In the next 5 years, we'll aim to unify and standardize the system of local governments across the country to establish a digital government. To achieve the digital transformation, we'll tackle the government development of 6G, which is expected to be introduced around the year 2030. This will come about through the combined efforts of industry, academia, and the government, while leveraging Japan's strengths and collaborating with the United States and European companies. In addition, we'll endeavor to create a framework for data-free flow with trust. We are currently working with the public and private sectors on the concept of trusted web, which is a project which creates a system that allows people to safely manage and value their own data without being locked into a specific platform, and which guarantees trust. Next is the Digital New Deal. last October, Prime Minister Suga declared that Japan will aim at carbon neutrality by the year 2050. And at the end of last year, we formulated the green growth strategy to achieve this goal. By creating innovation through the use of fund of around $18 billion over 10 years, the economic impact in 2030 is expected to be around $830 billion per year in 14 important fields, including offshore wind and hydrogen. In addition, we have reversed our corporate governance code, and for the first time among all major countries, require companies to expand their disclosure regarding climate change in terms of quality and quantity in accordance with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Finally, the Human New Deal, in an initiative to invent in people. We aim to create a society in which the abilities and ideas of diverse range of human resources, including women, young people, and foreigners, can flourish, and to break away from a society centered on middle-aged men. We will build a world-class research base by strengthening the development of young researchers and the industry academia collaboration through the approximately $90 billion university fund that was included in the economic stimulus package at the end of the last year. For children, we'll work to reduce class sizes over the next 5 years and achieve optimal individual learning by using ICT. Japan has been the first aging population in the world, with 28.7% of the population over 65 years of age, much higher than 16.2% in the United States. However, thanks to Abenomics, the number of employed women and elderly people increased by 3.34 million and 2.85 million, respectively, while the working age population decreased by 5.45 million over the past 7 years due to the declining birth rates and the aging population. The women's labor participation rate is 72.6%, which is higher than the 68.9% in the United States. The number of female executives at listed companies reached a record high of over 2,500 as of July last year. We'll further promote the participation of women in society. Beginning this April, companies are obligated to make efforts to ensure that their employees work until the age of 70, and from April next year, they were able to choose defer the starting age for receiving pension benefits to the age of 75. With these changes, I'd like to transform as many people as possible from those who are supported into those who support, in order to make our universal health insurance and pension system sustainable. We are also making every effort to accept professional human resources from overseas. In the past, wealthy professionals were told never to die in Japan because of the inheritance tax imposed on their worldwide assets if they resided in Japan for more than 10 years. Beginning this month, the tax system has been revised to exclude foreign assets from the inheritance tax. We will do our utmost to implement these 3 New Deal measures to draw out the ingenuity and willingness of the private sector to invest in and to create society where the abilities, ideas of diverse human resources can flourish. In the midst of the spread of country-first policy around the world, Japan has demonstrated its leadership as a strong supporter of free trade through the TPP-11 agreement and other trade agreements. As the chair of the TPP committees this year, Japan will further deepen discussion and promote cooperation in areas such as digital implementation and supply chain resilience. In order to spread this high standard and balanced set of rules for the 21st century throughout the world, we will continue to encourage an early conclusion of the agreement by the signatory countries and tackle the steady implementation and expansion of the TPP-11 agreement. With regard to the UK, United Kingdom, which has requested to join the TPP, will work as the chair to ensure that the process of starting negotiations can proceed smoothly in accordance with the procedures for membership, while assessing whether the UK is able to meet the high standard of the agreement. As the United States once led the TPP negotiations, I hope that Japan and the US will work together to continue to contribute to the development of free and fair trade based on the rules within the regional and global framework under the new Biden administration. This crisis is also an opportunity to accomplish reforms that have not been achieved in the past. We'll do our utmost to tackle these long-standing challenges in order to make up for lost 20 years of economic stagnation and deflation that have plagued us since the collapse of the bubble economy. In addition, international cooperation is important in this age of spread of country-first policies. Japan will deepen its cooperation with the United States and continue to exercise leadership in all aspects of international community to contribute to global economic growth. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Nishimura. You've given us a lot to talk about. I can already see in the chat questions, and we certainly will have questions for you later relating to your three New Deal proposals and U.S.-Japan cooperation in particular. But I will come back to that. So thank you very much for your remarks. Now, as our next speaker, as our commentator on the remarks of Minister Nishimura, it gives me great pleasure to introduce someone that I believe really is perfect for this sort of a Trans-Pacific discussion relating to the ravages of COVID-19 and the world into which we are moving beyond that. Our next speaker, Jennifer Nuzzo, is currently senior scholar with the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, and it's a real pleasure to have her as a colleague, of course. She's also an associate professor in several departments, including epidemiology in our Bloomberg School of Public Health. Also, she is Senior Fellow for Global Health at the Council on Foreign Relations, and you might have seen her recent article in Foreign Affairs on the global pandemic. as well as perhaps her appearances on CNN and her congressional testimony. She's a perfect participant here, I think, too, because she has special ties with Japan. She was telling me just before our meeting that she was a Japanese minor in college and that she also has relatives in Japan. And I know many of our participants today are across the Pacific in Japan. So it gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce Dr. Jennifer Nuzzo of the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. Jennifer, welcome to the Reischauer Center.
Thank you so much, Dr. Calder. And thank you, Honorable Minister Nishimura, for your excellent remarks. It's really a privilege to join you in this discussion about the global challenges of overcoming COVID-19. Just to reflect a little bit on where we are, as of today, there are more than 137 million cases that have been reported by 192 countries worldwide. And I just want to pause there and acknowledge that important accomplishment. The COVID story is really a bleak one, but there are some areas of success. And the fact that 192 countries have the capacity to report the existence of a completely new virus is an important development that we should acknowledge and celebrate. Of course, it's not good that there's a completely new virus in 192 countries, but the technical challenges in overcoming that, of being able to conduct the testing necessary to find it, is an important accomplishment. And it's one that would not have been possible without the support of the World Health Organization and international collaborations. And so we must give appropriate credit for the hard work that it took to develop those capacities. Global partnerships and solidarity help to make this happen. There is, of course, bad news in the COVID-19 story, and the fact that as of today, there are nearly 3 million reported deaths from this virus is a very bad development indeed. After a very welcome period of global decline in reported cases, the virus is now surging back in multiple parts of the world. For the last 2 weeks, more than 600,000 new cases were reported across the globe each day. But not all countries are faring poorly, and I think it's important for us to try to learn from their experiences. It's difficult to make country-to-country comparisons with respect to COVID. There are different contextualizing factors, and COVID data are not standardized between countries. But even with these limitations, I do think it is important and possible to understand what countries did that helped to limit the spread of COVID and how they may have also failed to do so. In the fall of 2019, a group of us at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, along with partners at the Nuclear Threat Initiative and the Economist Intelligence Unit, published the first ever Global Health Security Index, which benchmarked the health security capacities of 195 countries. And what we found just a few months before the pandemic started was that no country was fully prepared for a pandemic, particularly one of this scale. All countries lacked critical capacities and possessed important risks that could hinder their abilities to respond to a public health crisis, much less a very serious one like this. And though the Global Health Security Index scores were not correlated with country income, it wasn't surprising when we published the index that a number of high-income countries like the United States and the United Kingdom scored at the top. And given how poorly these countries in particular have fared during the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been some question about how we should interpret this. Should we conclude that perhaps countries with more public health capacities are less prepared? I don't believe so, and neither does the international panel of experts that advised us in putting together the Global Health Security Index. In my view, as an epidemiologist, having public health capacities is necessary, but not sufficient. That's a term we use often in epidemiology. But what did help countries combat COVID-19, and what was insufficient? And I think there are a few key lessons that have been emerging. The first one is that countries that have done well are those that availed themselves of the public health resources that they have. If you think of public health capacities like a fire protection system, When the alarm goes off, you use the signs and the emergency lighting to help find the fastest and safest path out of harm's way. That's what public health capacities are. Having these capacities can save lives if they're used as intended. But if the fire alarm sounds and a country does not heed its warning and use the resources to navigate to safety, it's regrettable. But is it the fault of the public health system, of the fire protection system? I would argue no. We saw that a number of countries, including the United States and the United Kingdom, did not use their public health capacities. They overly relied on travel restrictions at the exclusion of all other measures and took quite a bit of time to try to ramp up their domestic response. And in my view, that really, I think, set them back. The use of public health capacities, I think, is an area where Japan has done quite well. Japan's use of targeted public health interventions, such as its exquisite investigation of clusters of COVID infections, has, in my view, enabled it to rebound each time cases have surged. And Japan's epidemiologic investigations have been really important for improving global understanding about this virus and what we should do to control it. And I really have to give a lot of credit to the public health professionals in Japan for pursuing these efforts. Those targeted interventions are really hard. They're incredibly resource intensive. They require a lot of skill and commitment. And the fact that Japan has been able to keep its COVID case numbers better than a number of other countries through large use of these measures, I think is an important accomplishment. The other lesson that we have seen in the global response is that politicization of the COVID crisis and poor communication about COVID risks have really hindered a number of countries. It's been reported that the leadership in several countries have chosen to respond to the threat of COVID-19 by downplaying the risks or trying to score political points for their positions on it. Though it's a common tendency of inexperienced leaders to try to overly reassure the public, what we have seen in some of these countries is a much more concerted and deliberate attempt to sort of deny the existence of the pandemic. Japan, I think, to the contrary, has earned much praise for its public communication. Its early advice to the public to avoid closed spaces with poor ventilation, crowded spaces, and close contact with others, the 3 C's, as Minister Nishimura told us about, was quite, I think, important. I mean, first of all, it demonstrated quite early on an understanding of the most important drivers of transmission of this virus. In other countries, and I would argue the United States is one of them, are still struggling to prioritize in our communications how you can best protect yourself against the virus. We talk about a lot of things, but don't really focus on the things that matter most. And Japan, with its 3 C's campaign, I think was quite adept in understanding that not all exposures are the same and that prioritizing how to communicate about it was critically important. And I think that's why some of the reasons why there's been good adoption and adherence by the public. The third lesson in terms of the global response to COVID is that countries have often pursued nationalism over global approaches. And I really think that's been at the peril for all, but particularly for the countries who have taken those approaches. Here, I think Japan also should be commended. Its support for international initiatives is longstanding, particularly in the field of global health security. Japan has been a leader in promoting global health security, working through multilateral agreements to advance it, and for making financial commitments to improving global health security, in particular helping to bolster countries' national public health capacities. Those efforts are absolutely critical. Japan has been an active participant in many cross-border and regional health initiatives, and I really would like to commend Japan for its leadership in pushing for reform of global health agreements and financing to address pandemic threats. In our Global Health Security Index, Japan ranks quite highly in the area of international collaboration and compliance with international norms and treaties, and this is one area I think of great strength and should be an area of great pride in Japan's contributions to global health security. Going forward, how the pandemic will ultimately affect countries, I would argue, is still unknown. This is very much, I have to stress this is very much an event still in progress. And it's quite early for us to be able to account for all of the pandemic's tolls. But it's clear that they're considerable. They're already considerable, and they will continue to accrue. In thinking about what they may ultimately be, I think it's important to stress that pandemics harm in three ways. They sicken and kill in large numbers the people who are directly infected by the virus. They hurt in large numbers people who are not infected but may miss out on care for other diseases and conditions as a result of pandemic-related disruptions to the health system. And finally, they harm in terms of economic damages. And that last category is where we have yet to see the full tolls of this pandemic. As the economic harms of this pandemic are likely to continue for years, we will go for a long time trying to account for all of them. We also know that the effects will be considerable but not shared by all. A hallmark of the COVID-19 pandemic has been its ability to exacerbate underlying health, social, and economic disparities. Those who are struggling pre-pandemic have been harmed the most. Going forward, my biggest worry about the pandemic surrounds the global availability of vaccines and the deep disparities we see in which countries have access and which don't. The most obvious differentiator these days in terms of the trajectory that countries are on with their COVID epidemics is the degree to which they've been able to acquire and distribute vaccines. The fact that the vast majority of vaccines have gone to the highest income countries should worry all of us. This will not only exacerbate the already deep disparities we've seen in terms of harms caused by this virus, but it will also prolong the pandemic. And with the continued emergence and spread of genetic variants, no country will be truly safe or be able to fully return to economic prosperity until all countries gain access to vaccines. So just as countries and organizations partnered to enable the rapid expansion of laboratory capacities in order to detect this completely new virus, global partnerships and cooperation remain essential to ensuring that all countries have access to vaccines that will ultimately pave the pathway out of this pandemic. It's in every country's pragmatic best interest to pursue solidarity over isolationism. And I think it's fitting that the Summer Olympic Games are being held this year. The mission of the Olympic Games, as you may know, is to use sport to build a better world. And this is an important year for countries to recommit to working together to build a better world. And I'm thankful for the Olympics to remind and to inspire us to act in fulfillment of such a world. Thank you so much. Domo arigatou gozaimasu.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nuzzo. You have said some very important things, and I'm sure what you have to say about the importance of global cooperation and the way that Japan has helped to promote global health security, as well as what you had to say about the 3 C's are things that I'm sure a lot of people will be appreciating. Now, Minister Nishimura, as the next step, of course, we have questions. I can see in the chat a range of those questions, and perhaps I could outline what some of those questions are, and then maybe briefly, if there are some that relate particularly to Dr. Nuzzo, if you might have a comment or two, but then in conclusion, Minister Nishimura, if you could kindly give us your remarks. So, of course, the 3 new deals, there was considerable interest in those. One question or several questions related to those. How to use remote working to potentially increase female labor participation, whether under the human New Deal. That might be possible. The Green New Deal and its relationship to nuclear power. That was one. Now, I see that it looks as, one question, whether it's possible to predict when foreign visitors who've been vaccinated against COVID-19 might be able to enter Japan. I suppose there's both a healthcare dimension to that, but also, of course, the policy dimensions for Japan itself. The question of whether there might be matters relating to COVID in connection with Prime Minister Suga's visit. The question of economic recovery and how Japan plans to balance its relations with China, not only obviously in the healthcare area, but more generally. Perhaps maybe to start with this issue of the three New Deals, and whether in particular there is a healthcare dimension to some of what Japan is thinking about, or prescriptively speaking, what might be a positive, something positive in that area that could be added, or what forms of cooperation in healthcare between Japan and the United States might be potentially desirable. Of course, many of these are directed at Minister Nishimura, but briefly, Jennifer, I wondered whether you had any thoughts on the healthcare issues, perhaps the question of healthcare cooperation between Japan and the U.S., given what Nishimura-san has just said.
Would you like me to weigh in?
Yeah, maybe
Okay.
just briefly, yes.
Yes, I am in deep favor of enhanced cooperation in the area of healthcare. I mean, first of all, one of the, I think, bright spots on this pandemic has been on the global cooperation in terms of clinical trials. That has been really important to enable the more rapid development of therapeutics and vaccines. And I think that that's the pathway for the future, to have global trials rather than smaller investigator-led trials. So I think that's a very obvious area of collaboration. Certainly, I think on the surveillance front, we also need to do more to work together. And one of the challenges has been in terms of studying clinical outcomes of people hospitalized with this virus. It's one area where I think the United States particularly lags, because we don't have a national health insurance. We don't have national health insurance and don't have a national health system. So our data systems are all very fragmented, but countries that do have more ready access to those data, I think, yield very important insights in terms of risk factors for clinical outcomes, and as well as understanding what has helped improve clinical outcomes. And that's, I think, an area where enhanced partnerships can be made. And then I really do think that epidemiologic investigations are sort of an underexplored area of partnership as well. I mean, certainly ministries talk to each other and share information, but I also think that some of these very complex investigations do require larger and perhaps more synchronized approaches. One area where we don't have great data, but we would do very well to have better data in, is understanding which non-pharmaceutical interventions work and exactly how. And I think having some standardized approaches to study those would be quite helpful for us to know which interventions work. We have anecdote, we have observational data, but we don't have the kind of gold standard clinical trial type data for non-pharmaceutical interventions. And so I think that is an area of particular partnership. And then continued global commitment to help bolster public health capacities domestically and abroad. I mean, we have lived in this past year the consequences of both shortcomings of national capacities as well as vulnerabilities that countries have experienced as a result of not being truly able to isolate themselves from others. And so we have seen that, first of all, when a new virus emerges, understanding all of the parameters of what that virus is in the country where it is occurring, as well as the capacities of that country to contain the virus, are critically important for the world. And so all countries have a vested interest in those capacities being strong, and for there to be transparency about those capacities so that we can all gauge when containment is not going to be likely and when other countries will have to ready themselves to be able to respond domestically.
Thanks very much. We appreciate that very much. And in conclusion, Minister Nishimura, of course, there has been a lot said about cooperation. You mentioned yourself that the era of country first policies and the importance of U.S.-Japan cooperation. Dr. Nuzzle has suggested some specific areas, some of them, of course, a bit technical, but I wonder, there have been several questions that have come in, and they really come down to, I think, more than anything, this issue of U.S.-Japan cooperation in healthcare, but beyond that. Some of them, of course, are thinking specifically about what's happening here at the summit, but others about the long-term issues. So I wonder, in conclusion, if you could give us your thoughts on, in this era of country first policies, where you feel it's important to deepen cooperation between the United States and Japan at this important time, of course, with Prime Minister Suga visiting Washington, and you're also, of course, playing such an important role in U.S.-Japan, in Japan's global activities.
Thank you very much. And please allow me to speak in Japanese.
Surely.
まず日米の協力で2つの分野について、1つはヘルスケア、もう1つは経済の分野についてお話したいと思います。
In terms of Japan-US cooperation, let me touch upon two areas of potential cooperation. One is healthcare, and the other is economy.
でまずヘルスケアについては、今、ヌフォ教授からもありました、ナッゾ教授からもありましたけれども、いくつかの分野での協力を強化していくべきだと思っています。
In healthcare, I fully agree with Dr. Nuzzo that both Japan and the United States should further deepen collaboration and cooperation in many areas.
お話にあった治療薬、あるいはワクチンの開発、もうすでに多くのワクチンが開発されてますけれども、今後もさまざまな新たなバリアントな変異株が出てくることを考え、こうした分野での協力はあると思っています。
Already, we all know that the treatment and vaccines have been developed, and we already have different vaccines that are available. But we all know at the same time that there will continue to be new variants of the virus. Therefore, this will continue to be an important area for Japan and the United States to cooperate.
それから日本もう世界共通で高齢者あるいは、基礎疾患がある人が重症化しやすいということが分かってますが、若い人でも重症化する人がいて、これは重症化するそういう指標で重症化しやすいということが分かってきています。こうしたことの共有をしていくことが大事だと思います。
And data has become available that those who are aged and those who have preconditions tend to get serious symptoms from this COVID-19 virus. But at the same time, we also have data which shows that even the young people could develop severe symptoms of COVID-19. So these we know from the data and indicators. So it is very important, I believe, for the United States and Japan to share these data and indicators.
それからそれぞれの経験を共有していくこと、それぞれ、うまくいった面、うまくいってない面あると思いますので、この経験の共有が大事だと思います。
And through COVID-19, we have gone through experiences, and we know what has been successful and what have been less successful. Therefore, it is important for both nations to share lessons learned.
ナゾ教授が言われたように、日本は検査の数は多くはないんですけれども、焦点を絞って、ターゲットを絞って、検査をして、そこで封じ込めるという対策を取りました。アメリカの場合は割と幅広く多くの人に検査をするというやり方だと思います。それぞれのメリット、デメリットを検証することも大事だと思います。
As Dr. Nuzzo has just mentioned, Japan and the United States perhaps have taken different approaches when it comes to testing. In Japan, we have taken a more well-targeted approach in conducting our tests, and we have been successful in containing the spread of the virus by conducting well-targeted testing. I think the United States have taken a slightly different approach by conducting tests more widely. And I think it is important for both nations to share experiences and knowledges with regards to the pros and cons and benefits and drawbacks of these different approaches.
それから先ほども申し上げましたけども、野球場とかサッカーの球場、スタジアムで、観客5000人まで、あるいは1万人まで入れても、そこで感染が広がることは確認できていません。もちろん、大きな声出さないとか、食べ物は一定の制限をするとかっていうことをやってますが、そうしたデータに基づいた経済活動との両立も大事だと思っています。
And as I said earlier on during my presentation, that Japan has allowed up to 5,000 or up to 10,000 in some cases spectators at baseball stadiums and soccer stadiums, but we haven't witnessed any serious spread of infections by doing so. Of course, we have to discourage people from shouting. We have to discourage people from eating and drinking while watching games. But I think it is very important in view of reopening our economic activities that we make decisions based on solid data.
映画館も一席ずつ開けることでずっと営業していました。また飲食店も時間短縮はやってもらいましたけれども、閉めることはやらずに、感染は9割減少させることができています。
And for movie theaters, we have asked people to sit while you have one seat vacant between people. And film theaters, movie theaters have always been operating, doing business in Japan during the pandemic. And we have asked the stores, restaurants to shorten their business hours, but we haven't asked them to close their shops altogether. And through these measures, nevertheless, Japan has been able to reduce infections by 90%.
今、マンハッタンでは最新の状況間違っているかもしれませんが、人数を4分の1まで、レストランは入って営業というふうに、あるいは屋外はいいというふうに認識していますが、それぞれのそうしたことの経験、あるいはデータに基づく分析を共有していくことが大事だと思っています。今後のためにですね。
I hear, correct me if I'm wrong, but in Manhattan, as we speak, restaurants are now allowed to accommodate 1/4 of their capacity, and people can eat outside restaurants just outside restaurants. So we have different experiences in Japan and the United States, and we have data available to us. So it is important for Japan and the United States to share our experiences and analysis based on data.
それから無症状の方、軽症の方も、この COVID は突然重症化していくことがありますので、ウェアラブルな機材でですね、その状況の変化を見るという、こうした新たな技術の開発も 大事だと思っています。共同でできればと思います。
Also, it is important that the United States and Japan cooperate in developing new technologies. For example, I mean, we know that this virus, those without symptoms and those only with mild symptoms could certainly develop severe symptoms. Therefore, a development of wearable devices could be very important so that we can constantly monitor the symptoms and the conditions of patients and infected people. So that is one possible area where Japan and the United States can cooperate in terms of developing technologies.
経済の分野については、やはり、自由な貿易、自由な投資、国際協力が進む、そうした枠組みを日米が主導して、維持し、構築していくこと、発展させていくことが大事だと思います。
And in the area of trade, it continues to be very important for Japan and the United States to preserve, build, and further develop international cooperation framework to promote free trade and free investments.
ちょっとした工場のアクシデントで、例えば自動車の半導体が足らなくなったり、あるいはテキサスの大寒波で、半導体が足らなくなったりというような事例を毎年のように聞いています。
I mean, we have seen almost every year a shortage of supplies of critical materials. For example, an accident at a production factory could result in a shortage of supply of semiconductors for automobile manufacturing, and a cold wave, for example, in the state of Texas, could cause a shortage of semiconductor supply, and this has to be addressed.
サプライチェーンのこの強靭化、多層化、こういったことをですね、我々今アジアでは CPTPP で進めてますけれども、ぜひ日米で世界のこうしたサプライチェーンの強靭化を進めていければと思います。
And so we need to make our supply chains more resilient, and we have to make our supply chains more multi-layered, and it is for this purpose that we have CPTPP in Asia, but I would argue that Japan and the United States should strive to build a more resilient supply chain globally.
もう一つは分野がやはり最先端の技術の開発、これは当然中国のことを頭に置きながら日米の協力を進めていかなきゃいけないと思います。
Also, another area where we need to see further cooperation between the United States and Japan is development of cutting-edge technologies, obviously with China at the back of our mind.
特に先ほど少し触れましたけれども、5G の後の 6G の分野での半導体はじめとするさまざまな技術、これを日米を中心としながら、また、EU にも欧州にも優れた企業がありますので、日米欧で、協力をしながら開発を進めていくことが大事だと思います。
For example, 5G, we are now in the area of 5G, but after 5G there will be 6G. So it will be critically important for Japan and the United States to jointly develop semiconductors and other technologies that will be required during in the 6G era. And Japan and the United States should be at the center of this initiative with working closely with European companies because there are advanced companies in Europe as well.
いずれにしましてもバイデン大統領が最初にリアル対面で会う首脳が菅総理ということで大変嬉しく思いまして、日米の絆の強さを示す象徴だと思いますけれども、さまざまな分野で日米の協力、そしてそうした固い絆が確認されることを期待をしております。
Well, I'm very pleased that President Biden chose Prime Minister Suga as the Prime Minister leader of a country to have the first real non-virtual meeting after the inauguration of the new administration. So I'm very pleased to see that. It is very symbolic of the strong bond that we enjoy between Japan and the United States, and I hope that they will reaffirm the strong ties and bonds between our two nations, and will see further progress in our bilateral cooperations.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Nishimura. You've given us a lot to think about. And of course, particularly with the interventions and comments from Dr. Nuzzo, I think we've had an extremely important discussion on two crucial topics of U.S.-Japan cooperation, healthcare and also trade, with some very fresh ideas to my mind. This idea of the wearable devices, for example, and how our two countries could cooperate. Some really new ideas. And Minister Nishimura, we sincerely thank you for your time, as busy as you are now. And also Dr. Nuzzle, Jennifer, thank you very, very much. So this concludes our program. Thank you also to all of you who are participating with us here at the Reischauer Center, and we look forward to continuing our dialogue. ありがとうございました。これからよろしくお願いします。
ありがとうございました。See you soon in Washington,
you.
D.C.
Yes,
Thank you.
indeed. We look forward to it. Goodbye.